My name's Jason, and I'm a lead pastor at Unley Park Baptist Church. And there's a small group, a very small group in the room, and a whole bunch of you online. I'm just looking here, folk from Victor Harbour and the surrounding areas, and even so it's just fantastic for you to join us today. We have here as well, sitting next to me, Sarah. She's our community pastor. And Sarah's been liaising with our speaker tonight, Michelle. So I'll get her to introduce her. Our church runs these community seminars for families. We've been doing it for 4 years. We've looked at supporting teenagers and helping families with little kids. And this is a pretty important and serious topic about how to help children keep their bodies safe. Tricky conversation. I have 4 kids. A couple of them are probably old enough to figure this out themselves, but I know something of what it means when you're trying to talk to children about how they can keep themselves safe. So I look forward to hearing from Michelle as she shares with us in just a minute. She's online, and we'll get to her in a minute. Sarah, could you just introduce Michelle for us?
Sure. It's great to be here tonight, and thank you for joining us. And I just want to thank Michelle for all that she's done in preparation for tonight. And just to give you a little bit of an idea about Michelle, I've basically just stolen some information about you, Michelle, over the internet, but it tells me that you are a mother of 4 children, and that you obviously are very committed to seeing children be educated and taught these skills of being empowered to help keep their bodies safe. And Michelle has written this great little book here, which is called Only for Me. And she's going to talk about that a little bit more as we go through tonight. And it's a fantastic picture book to use for children, to talk with them and help them to understand about this topic. So I'd love to hand it over to Michelle, and I'm sure she'll tell you a few more interesting things about herself. And we really thank you, Michelle, for taking us on this journey with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you tonight to talk to you about a topic that is very close to my heart, and that is, how do we go about empowering and protecting our little ones against sexual assault? So essentially, there are 2 key things that I want to achieve tonight. Number 1, I hope you leave this workshop with a deep understanding of why it's so important to proactively protect our children. And number 2, I hope you leave this workshop feeling empowered, that you now have the tools and the knowledge and the techniques to have effective conversations with your young children. So obviously tonight we are going to be talking about a topic that is very confronting. So if at any point you are feeling very overwhelmed or emotionally triggered, then I just ask that you do practice self-care and actually encourage you to take a break if you feel that you need to. Okay, so I am going to share my screen here for a minute. Okay, I'm actually getting a message saying that I can't, that the host has disabled the screen sharing. So if you could just, yep, do that, I'll be able to share it. Okay. So we're going to have just going to give you a quick overview of what we are going to be discussing tonight. So first of all, I'm going to give you a bit of background information about how I actually came to write Only for Me and the events that actually inspired the book. We're then going to look at the what, the when, the why, and the how when it comes to protecting our children. What do we need to do to protect them? When should we start this process? Why is it so important? And then for the majority of the night, we'll look at how we actually go about achieving this. And then to finish off, hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A. I can't promise to be able to answer all your questions, but hopefully I'll be able to point you in the right direction if I can't. Okay, so a little bit about background information. My background wasn't always in child protection. It was actually in administration and marketing. But for the last 17 years, essentially, I've been a stay-at-home mum. So as already mentioned, I've got 4 children, and here is a photo of them in the early days of Only For Me. My 2 little girls there are now all grown up. So this is Emily and Charlotte recently. And here is Jack and Tom. So lucky I've got the boys to keep me feeling young. Okay, so I'm just going to stop the screen share there now. Okay, so tonight I simply stand before you as a mum who went on an unexpected journey into child protection when back in 2014 I went out for dinner. And on this night I heard about 2 separate cases where young children had actually been sexually abused by children their own age. This, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those stories in a moment. And this journey culminated 2.5 years after that night with the release of my picture book, Only For Me, which very gently teaches your children that their body is private and that they have a right to protect that privacy. So in the interim 2.5 years, I consulted with expert professionals and I conducted a lot of research to ensure that Only For Me would become a very powerful tool for parents, carers, and teachers and educators. So it's been a pretty amazing journey. I'm now a very passionate advocate. I do a lot of work raising awareness about this topic. I've also done a lot of fundraising. I've raised over $20,000 for child protection organisations. And Only For Me itself seems to just keep going from strength to strength. So it actually reached number 8 on Amazon USA's bestseller list earlier this year. And we've sold about 50,000 copies now worldwide. And we've got translations in the pipeline. We're starting with Spanish and German translations. But I hope that there'll be more to come. So Only For Me and this mission has pretty much become a full-time gig for me. Okay, so now I want to tell you more about those stories. So as I said, I went out for dinner and 2 of the mothers shared experiences that their child had encountered. So in the first instance, I'm going to call him Sam tonight. Sam was 7 years old and he was at a play date at the park during the school holidays. And it was on the way home from this play date that he revealed to his mum that the other young boy had been touching him inappropriately as they played on the play equipment. So Sam's mum rang up the other mum to tell her what had actually taken place. And this other mother then revealed to Sam's mum that they had discovered their son several months before inadvertently accessing pornography on his iPad. So this is going back in the earlier days when we weren't quite as aware about the controls and the measures we need to put in place to keep our kids safe online. And whilst they then put some controls in place, they weren't actually aware that he had already been affected by what he'd been exposed to, and he was actually acting out because of that material. So it was absolutely key that Sam knew that the behaviour was inappropriate and that he needed to tell someone about it, because the flow-on effect was then that he was actually able, this other young boy was able to get the help that he needed. In the second case, the abuse also happened to take place between 2 boys at a park. And this time they were walking home from school, as they often did. And when the 11-year-old asked his mum if he could go to the bathroom, she sent him with his classmate, who was also 11, while she watched the other younger siblings on the play equipment. And after a couple of minutes, she suddenly sensed something was wrong. And so she raced over to the cubicle, which was sort of the individual ones that open up directly onto the park. And she opened the door and horrifically she was faced or presented with her young boy being sexually abused, but it wasn't by a stranger, it was actually by this other 11-year-old boy. Now, what we know is that any child that acts out in this way has been traumatised. And more often than not, that trauma is the fact that they're actually being sexually abused themselves and they're actually reenacting what is being done to them as a coping mechanism. And it's very likely that that was the case in this particular story. So I got home from this night and I was completely shocked. I had no idea that my children were at risk of abuse by children their own age. And I had no idea that abuse could actually take place whilst I was essentially supervising my own children. And I think the fact that these stories took place within my immediate community really brought home to me that my children were just as much at risk as these other young children, and that I actually had a responsibility to do something about it. Now, at this point, I hadn't really spoken to my children much about body safety. I'd simply told my two girls very briefly that no one was allowed to touch their private parts, and that was the extent of the conversation that I sort of ticked off my list. And my son, who was 4 at the time, I actually hadn't broached the topic with because I actually thought that he was in fact too young. This was before I actually had my 4th son. However, I was wrong. And the more I began to research the topic, the more I realised that as a parent, I had a responsibility to educate my children by having comprehensive body safety conversations with them on a regular basis. And so it was as I came to this realisation that I started to look about for a resource that would empower my kids with very specific knowledge. And unable to find a resource to help me do that, I then sat down and wrote Only for Me. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to what do we do about this? Okay. So the number one thing we need to be doing is having body safety conversations with our children. Now, body safety conversations teach our children that their body is private and that they have a right to protect that privacy. And they can otherwise be known or referred to as protective behaviour conversations. Now, these conversations need to teach our children to identify unsafe situations, inappropriate behaviour, and grooming techniques. So ideally, we want them to be able to identify the specific tools and tricks that a predator would use during that grooming process. We then want to teach our children how to respond to these unsafe situations, behaviours, and grooming techniques. And as part of that, we actually want to develop their problem-solving skills so that they will be able to identify, respond, and disclose. And the final and if we're not talking about this topic, then how on earth are they going to be able to bring the topic up with us whenever they're feeling concerned or worried about something that's happened? Now, there's one piece of knowledge that needs to underpin all body safety conversations. And it applies not just to this topic, but other aspects of your child's life. And it's a really important thing that we need to establish with our children, no matter what we're teaching them. And that is, we want them to know that nothing is ever so awful that they can't talk to someone about it. So that's really important when obviously comes to this, these types of conversations, but it's also important in other aspects of their lives. So it might be to do with they're being bullied at school, perhaps their mental health, how they're feeling, or if they've experienced something that has scared them or worried them. So that's a really important point to remember tonight. Okay, so now we know the what, we need to have a look at the when. When do we need to be having these body safety conversations? I actually recommend that you begin educating your children from at least 3 years of age. And there are two main reasons why we need to do this. Essentially, our kids are at risk of abuse at this young age, which is horrific to think about. So if our kids are at risk of abuse, we can't wait till they're older, because it could actually be too late. And so that's why it's really important that we start these conversations as early as possible. The other reason why it's important to begin these conversations early is so that it becomes a normal and natural part of your relationship with your child. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, we certainly didn't have body safety conversations in our household. And really we didn't talk about our bodies or sexual development very freely at all. And so I guess I inherited that from my parents. And so when it came to having those conversations with my own children, I did feel very overwhelmed about broaching the topic. And that's, I guess, why I'd only ever had those very basic conversations with my kids prior to going on this journey. However, I can assure you that once you change that behaviour, and I can testify that with my youngest son, I started from day dot, it becomes so much easier for you as a parent. The response that you get from young children is just so natural. So not only will you be put at ease yourself, but it'll just become very normal for your children. And so it's just a wonderful way of starting the conversation. Okay, so I said before that I'd felt that it was something that I could tick off my list. But what actually needs to happen is that we need to reinforce body safety conversations on a regular basis. Just like we would if we were talking about road safety or stranger danger, it's not something that you cross off your list. You actually revisit and reinforce it with your child. And so it's really important that we do that with body safety conversations as well. And it's also important that we revisit these conversations as our child grows and circumstances change as well. So as they develop, you're going to match the conversation with their maturity level. And so it's really important that we revisit and build upon the conversations as they grow. Okay, so now we know the what and the when. Now we're going to have a look at the why. Why do we need to have these body safety conversations? Okay, so the number one reason why we want to have these conversations is because childhood sexual abuse is a very real and prevalent issue facing Aussie kids. Now I'm going to present to you some of the statistics that I came across during my research, and these come from the Australian Institute of Criminology's website, and actually based on reported cases. So this first statistic is, so of reported cases that they knew, that of the cases that were reported, 11% of girls and 5% of boys reported being sexually abused before the age of 15. So I was very overwhelmed when I first heard that statistic, but I also needed to put it into context to make it meaningful to me. And so I had to think about it, and I realised that in a typical primary school class of 25 kids, that's at least 2 children who will report being sexually abused before the age of 15. So it is definitely not an issue that we can ignore. Now, what we do know is, as I said, these were just reported cases. And unfortunately, that just means that it's the tip of the iceberg, because so much abuse goes unreported. So in reality, it's more likely that 5 children every primary school class will experience some sort of sexual harm before their 18th birthday. So that's 1 in 5 kids, or 20% of kids. And so once again, we're reminded just how important this topic is. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, Michelle, you're right, those statistics really are horrible, but surely they don't apply to me and my family. However, the truth is that childhood sexual abuse cuts across all demographics of society. So it actually doesn't matter where you live, what cultural background you're from, what your job is. None of those issues mean that your children or child won't be at risk. And so it's really important that we all make sure that we have these conversations. Okay, and I'm apologise because this is a very overwhelming part of the night, but I do think it is important that we as parents and carers do acknowledge the reality of child abuse in Australia if we're actually going to tackle the topic. So sadly, child abuse is actually normally carried out by someone known to the child and trusted by the parents. Okay, so in approximately 90% of those reported cases that we talked about on the last slide, the victim will actually know their abuser. And in approximately half of those cases, so I think it was about 43%, the victim was actually abused by a relative. And in the remaining 45% of cases, the child was actually abused by someone otherwise known to them. So it could be a neighbour or an acquaintance or someone otherwise known, a family friend. So unfortunately, abuse often takes place in circumstances or surroundings that we don't normally imagine. So it's not all about stranger danger. And what I found even more alarming, and obviously the stories that I encountered inspired me to go on this journey. But when I researched the topic, I actually discovered that peer-on-peer abuse is actually a very significant issue. And Braveheart's now saying that somewhere between 30 to 60% of all childhood abuse is actually carried out by other children or young people. And once again, I think that changes the way that we see abuse and and the way that we need to protect our children and in the situations that we need to protect them. So I guess I was under a false sense of security initially before I went on this journey. But when I realised how and when my child is most likely to be abused, then I really understood that I actually had this responsibility to give them the information so that they could protect themselves, because naturally I can't be with my kids at every minute of every day. Okay, so the third reason, I've just said it there ahead of myself, we can't be with our kids all the time, and nor should we. We want them to grow into healthy, autonomous adults, and that's really important. And so if they're going to be independent from us, then we need to educate them. And ultimately, the reason we want to have these conversations is because we want our children to be able to recognise the earlier stages of the grooming process, so then they can respond appropriately, hopefully before any significant harm takes place. And I'll tell you a little story about my own son. It was about 18 months after I rode Only for Me, and we were at swimming lessons. And he was about 6 or 7 at the time, and my other son was about 2. And he was, they were both in the same swimming pool, but he was in a different class to my youngest, who I had sort of sat right next to during the lessons and you know, tried to stop him from jumping out of the pool. So I kept my eye on my older son, but most of my focus had been on my younger boy that day. And it was as we were leaving the swimming lessons that one of the boys in his class actually turned around and said a very polite but very mature and formal farewell to my son. And Jack actually just ignored him. And so as we walked out, I reprimanded him and I said, Jack, you really need to respond and be polite to your friend. And he just turned to me and he said, he's not my friend, Mum. And I said, well, okay, he's not your friend, but we still be polite. And he said, but Mum, he's a naughty boy. And so I asked him, thankfully, why is he naughty? And he turned around and told me that this young boy, who I believe was also around that 6 or 7 age, was doing what Only For Me says you shouldn't do. So in that moment, as you can imagine, my heart sank. And when I spoke to my son and asked him questions about what had actually taken place, my concern quickly actually shifted to the other young boy, because it really did sound like he was reenacting grooming behaviours. And so once again, I think it's likely that he was a victim of abuse himself. So I was just so proud of my son that he was able to identify the behaviour as being inappropriate. And so he told me straight away. And so, yes, he had a half an hour lesson where he was feeling threatened by this child. He was actually telling him not to do it. However, the child was continuing to insist as they waited at each end of the pool while the other people in the class would swim back and forth. It was all going on under the water. But it just demonstrates once again just the importance of these conversations, the importance of educating our kids so that they can then identify it in the earlier stages. So it's really important. Okay. I'm glad that part of the night is over. I don't know about you, but I always find it very draining, actually, having to think about the reality of abuse in Australia, because it is very confronting. But now we're going to put our focus on what can we do about it and how do we have these body safety conversations. So the first few points I've got are more about how you want to approach the topic. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is make sure that you research it so you can be confident and calm when talking to your child. So the good news is you're already all doing that because you're here tonight listening to this workshop. Okay, so the other thing you want to do is approach the topic gently. Okay, and you can do this by using a range of resources. Using age-appropriate language is really important because, number one, you don't want to confuse your child. You want to keep the language simple so that they actually understand what you're saying. But you also want to be really gentle so that you don't alarm or frighten your child. You obviously want them to be alert. You want them to be aware, but we don't want to make them fearful. Okay, so one of the ways that we can do that is to use a resource, and that will help facilitate the conversation and engage your child. So obviously, Only For Me is available, but when I wrote Only For Me, there were only one or two other options when it came to choosing a book on this topic. However, it has become obviously much more topical over the last few years. And so you'll find that there's actually a whole range of different resources that are available to you to introduce this topic to your children. And the last point, when it comes to approaching this topic with your children, is that you want to do so individually, because you need to adjust the conversation to match each of their to match their maturity and each of their developmental stages. So whilst it's fine to sort of start talking about the topic generally to your children, sitting them down together and doing it together, I then recommend that you make sure that you sit with each of them individually so that you can tailor the conversation to their developmental stage and their maturity. Okay, so the main thing or takeaway point that I'm really passionate about is that we need to provide our children with very specific information. We don't want to just speak in general terms, because when we do that, they're unlikely to be able to identify a lot of that manipulative behaviour that goes on during the grooming process. So I'm going to now run through the list of information that I believe it's very important to cover. Okay, so the first thing you want to be doing is using the correct anatomical terms for your child's private parts. So that is penis, testicles, vulva, vagina. As I said, it was very awkward for me to use those terms when my children were younger. It was just part of the way that I'd been brought up. And so when my son was born and my husband started using the term that his Lebanese grandparents had used for his penis, he used to refer to it as my son's endushi. Well, that's my pronunciation anyway. And so when my husband started doing this, I thought, okay, that's a much nicer, easier way for me to have to refer to my son's penis. So I'm going to start using that term. However, what I didn't realise at the time was that when we don't use the correct terms, we're endangering our children. And that's because any disclosure or any time that they reach out to someone, if they're not using the correct anatomical terms, it can actually get lost in translation. So now we know that abuse can happen in circumstances and situations that we didn't previously imagine. For instance, let's say that my son was at his preschool playing in a tunnel or a fort out in the yard, and he came in to a teacher who more than likely had a lot of youngsters trying to get her attention at the time, and said that Charlie had pulled his undushi. Hopefully that teacher would have the time to question my son and find out exactly what he's talking about. However, if she's got multiple things going on, it potentially can go under the radar. Whereas if my son had walked in and said, Charlie was touching my penis, then straight away alarm bells are going to go off for that teacher. And she's obviously going to give her full attention to the child who's disclosing that. So it's as simple as that. It's also important when it comes to worst case scenario, any forensic interviews or court cases, it's integral. It's essential that the correct anatomical terms have been used during the disclosure, because otherwise it can actually get thrown out of court. So if you're not doing it already, I really ask that you stop using any of these soft made-up names that we have for different private parts, and actually make sure that you are using the correct terms and that you're using them, or that you're also teaching them in English. So if you speak multiple languages in the home, obviously your child is operating in Australia, where English is the main language. So it's really important that you would also teach them the terms in English and teach them to use those terms whenever they're referring to their private parts. So really important. Okay. So we want to teach our kids that their private parts are not for sharing, touching, feeling, or photographing by another person. And that photographing is really important in this technological age, when now not just the adults, but most of the kids actually have mobile phones in their pockets or iPads. So it's really important that from a very young age, we teach our children that is in fact inappropriate. We want our kids to know that this is wrong for someone, that it's wrong for someone else to expose their private parts or show them any images of private parts in pictures, movies, or on any sort of device. So essentially, we're talking about pornography, but obviously we want to keep it age appropriate. So we don't need to use that term, but we need to teach them still that type of behaviour, which can quite often be part of the grooming process, is inappropriate. We also want our kids to know that it doesn't matter if someone calls it a game, rewards them, gives them treats or gifts, it's still not okay. And of course, these are the different tools that a predator will employ to manipulate your child. So we want to take that power away from them. And now we want them to know that these rules apply no matter the person's gender, relationship, age, or status in the community. And obviously that's just so important, so that nobody can try and justify the abuse using any of those reasons. So by teaching our children that there is no exception, then hopefully they're going to speak up if anyone tries to justify their behaviour based on any of those groups. Okay. Now this is another essential point. We want our kids to know that they can say no at any point that someone's touch doesn't feel right. And that can include kissing, stroking, cuddling, snuggling, tickling, either through clothes or direct touch. And the reason that that's so important is because if what we're trying to achieve is to get our kids to identify abuse in the earlier stages and to respond to that, then we need to give them authority over their body. We need to teach them that they're the boss of their body. And so it doesn't actually matter what the touch is. If it makes them feel uncomfortable, then they're allowed to speak up and to say no. We need to teach our children that abusive behaviour is never a secret, even when threatened. And we'll talk about secrets when we read through the book. And this is just so important. I actually had a friend come to me during the process of when I was writing Only for Me, and I sort of showed her the manuscript, and she then disclosed to me that she was in fact a victim of abuse herself. And she talked about how her father had actually threatened her mother if she ever told her mother about what was taking place, that he would actually kill her mother. And so once again, we want to take that power away from the predators. And so I actually do say to the young children that it doesn't matter what they say, it doesn't matter if they tell you something bad's going to happen. It's just a big trick because they want you to keep quiet. So once again, shifting that power. We want our kids to know that abusive behaviour is not their fault and they won't be in trouble. Now, this is really important, once again, because the process, sadly and horrifically, can be so manipulative and take place over quite a long period. There may be a point in that process where the child was actually enjoying being engaged with that person. As I said, it might have started off as a game, it might have started off as tickling, and the perpetrator can actually sort of often coerce the victim into agreeing to their enjoyment. And so once again, we want to remind kids that even if they think somehow that they're to blame, somehow that it's their fault, it's okay. They are not to blame. They are not in trouble, and they need to tell someone that they can trust. And that takes us on to this next point. So we want our kids to know that they need to tell us or another trustworthy adult. And again, we'll talk about that in a moment, how we need to make sure we've got a network of people that our children can talk to. If anyone does any of these things, or at any point that someone makes them feel uncomfortable. And that's just a reminder there again, we want to do this with the knowledge that nothing is ever so awful that they can't talk to someone about it. Okay. So hopefully you're starting to see how we're trying to shift that power, how we're trying to disarm those predators of those tools and those techniques and those tricks that they use to coerce and manipulate their victims. So if we can educate our kids using this very specific information, then hopefully they're going to be able to identify this type of behaviour as inappropriate and speak up in the earlier stages of abuse. The other thing that can happen is that when a perpetrator hears a child speaking out in such a way, for instance, it could be using the correct anatomical terms for their private parts. That indicates to the perpetrator that this child's actually been educated about body safety. And so sometimes it will actually be a red flag for the perpetrator, and they'll actually move on to another victim. So there's more than one benefit to having these conversations. Okay. Once again, I apologise, guys. I understand that this is a very overwhelming topic, and that seems like a huge amount of information to pass on to our kids. So hopefully what I'm going to show you next is how I've managed to incorporate all those concepts into Only for Me in a way that will engage your child, in a way that is gentle, and in a way that won't scare or alarm your children. So I will stop as I read the book and talk about some of the ways that you can actually build on some of these concepts as you're talking to your child. It's important to note that no matter what resource you use, it's not there to replace conversations. So it's there to facilitate them. It's there to help you, to guide you, to engage your child. But we are always doing it. We're always having those, introducing that topic, and then ensuring that we are following it up with conversation with our child. So here's Only for Me. I was very blessed. I had a wonderful illustrator at my children's school. She was a former Disney animator, and she's actually currently working on a lot of animation for ABC. So I was able to go to her after I'd written the manuscript and ask her whether or not she'd be open to illustrating this very tricky topic. We weren't quite sure how we were going to do it, but I think Nicole's done a really beautiful job, and I think it's her illustrations that also help just to normalise the topic and the conversation, and really engage your child. I'm often amazed when I get feedback from parents who say that they're actually that Only for Me has become their favourite bedtime story. And whilst I'd hoped that it would obviously be read not as a one-off, never in my wildest dreams did I think that they would actually be choosing to read it on a regular basis. So that's really lovely. So I'll quickly go through the first few pages. We start off by talking about different body parts. So these are my eyes, so sparkly and bright, seeing and blinking and closing at night. This is my mouth, very handy, you see, for eating and talking and smiling with glee. These are my hands with fingers so long for holding and counting and clapping to song. These are my feet as strong as can be for walking and dancing and holding up me. This is my tummy, it's so very cool. It grumbles and rumbles and loves to be full. I've got a bit of feedback from my 2-year-old on this page. Well, he's 7 now, so 5 years ago, that he was most concerned that the boy's head had been chopped off. So it was very cute. So when I did a new print run a couple of years ago, I just haven't updated this slide. I had to get Nicole to put his head back in because it was just so beautiful seeing it from a 2-year-old's perspective, that he was very concerned that his head had disappeared. Okay, so here we have the gentle shift. This is my bottom and bits that they're very private and only for me. They have proper names that are good to use. That way no one gets confused. Girls have a vulva and a vagina. Boys have a penis and testicles. It's an opportune time for you to stop with your child and perhaps encourage them to identify their own private parts using those correct anatomical terms. Now, no one can touch or make me show, and if they try, I must say no. No one's to look or take a photo. The answer's still no, 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 no. And you'll find without any encouragement, the kids love to join in with that no, 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 no. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I want to point out on this page. I made a deliberate choice when writing Only for Me to use the term no one. And that's because every family situation is different and circumstances are going to differ depending on the age and developmental stage of your child. So I've used the blanket term no one, and it's up to you as the primary caregiver to clarify any exceptions if that's necessary. So for instance, I would say to my youngest at the time, it's okay if Karen and Therese use toilet paper to clean your bottom when you've done a poo at preschool. So note, I didn't just use a general exception. I used the people's names and I gave him very specific information about where it's okay for someone to see his private parts and to touch his bottom with toilet paper. Okay, so obviously depending on the age of your children, your family situation, so whether or not you have extended family that can help, that help hands-on caring for your little ones, then you'll need to make that clarification with them. On the other hand, my son, who was older at the time, there was absolutely no one that I needed to make an exception for. Some people ask about doctors, but that actually did come up for us a couple of years ago. But of course, I was with my son at the time and I told him that he would need to have an examination by the doctor, but it was always done in the context of consent. So the doctor asked my son whether he was comfortable with it and would it be okay if he examined him. And so it's all, those exceptions are always done in the context of consent. Okay, so the next thing that we need to talk about when it comes to responding is what are the different ways our kids can respond. So only for me, I've got the words there, no, 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 no. And that's the most basic response. And it's great for little kids, as I said, to join in, but it's obviously appropriate in a situation where the abuse is taking place and we want the child to scream out or shout out no or stop. So it's really good that you get them to practice saying it out loud because what we know is that when a child is faced with any of these situations, it can be hard for them to know exactly what to do because they'll be frozen in fear. So if you actually get them to practice saying these things out loud, it can really help for them to recall it if they ever find themselves in that situation. So we actually need to develop that response. So obviously there are the basic response for little ones to keep it simple. And obviously there would be some situations where the behaviour would warrant someone's screaming no or stop. But because we know that this manipulative process can often take place over time, it may be that somebody is touching them in a way that just makes them feel uncomfortable. And so, as I said before, it might be tickling them or, playing a game where they're touching them. We want our kids to feel like that they can speak up as the boss of their body and actually tell people that they're not comfortable with that. And so to do that, we want to practice a sentence that they could use in different situations. So I've taught my kids just to say, please stop, I don't like that. Okay, so it doesn't really matter what the sentence is, but it's important that you choose a sentence and that when you do visit this topic with your child, that you actually get them to practice saying that, to practice that sentence out loud. So once again, depending on the age of your child, but you'll know as the primary caregiver when they're ready to start saying a sentence. Okay, so then the third step is talking to our children about ways that they can excuse themselves if they ever find themselves in a situation where, once again, there's nothing happening that warrants them shouting out a no or stop. There may actually not be any touch being involved at that stage. There may not even be anything for them to say, please stop to. But they may have found themselves in a situation where they might be, at a family gathering or at a party, at a park, and somehow they've found themselves separated from the main group, separated from their parents, and their intuition is telling them that something's not right and they're not feeling comfortable being alone with this person. And so once again, when that intuition kicks in and they're feeling fearful, it can be hard for them to recall and think of ways of actually getting back to safety. And so when we talk to our kids about this, remind them about it, then they're more likely going to be able to respond appropriately. So I recommend that you give your child you give them the permission, is the word I'm looking for. You give them the permission to use an excuse if they ever have to, if they ever find themselves in this situation. So 2 excuses that you might like to use are, I really need to go to the toilet. You might like to use, I'm feeling really sick, I need to find mum. Or it could be, you know, I can hear mum or dad calling, or they said I can only be a minute. Once again, it gives them the opportunity to get away from that person. Now, obviously, the idea is not that they would then go to the toilet alone. They would instead actually go and find the rest of the group, or their parents, or whoever they feel comfortable with, so that they've got themselves out of that situation. And the final thing that we can do with our kids is actually establish a code. So that could be something that they can say to you, but as your child gets older and you know, they have a mobile phone available to them, it could actually be something that they can text to you. So for instance, with my girls, they don't suffer from migraines. So if they ever said to me, Mum, I've got a really bad migraine, then I know that they're feeling unsafe and that I need to come and pick them up, or I need to, you know, go and find them in whatever situation we're in. And that's an alert to me that that they're feeling unsafe and that they need assistance. So it's just about developing the responses as your child grows and as they mature. And once again, it's up to you as the primary caregiver to do that as you see fit and as you feel that they're ready for that next step. Okay, we'll start speeding through now. And even if my clothes are there, and definitely when my body is bare, and even if they say it's a game, and even if their bottom's the same, and even if they give me treats or gifts. So once again, we don't want our kids to only disclose when someone is actually abusing them. We don't want to just teach them that it's about their private parts, or that it's what's under their underwear. We want to give them the authority to say no, even if it's through their clothing, that it's still okay for them to speak up. And it's not okay if they show me theirs, because bottoms are private and not to be shared, not even in photos or on the TV, not on computers or in a movie. And once again, we've had to update these illustrations when one of the kids pointed out that they weren't exactly sure what was on the stool there. It is, of course, a camera. However, we've now replaced that with an iPhone. So if you purchase a copy, you will find that you've got the updated illustration. Okay, so I can say no whenever I like if someone's touch doesn't feel right. It might be a kiss, or maybe a snuggle, or stroking my body when having a cuddle. So here you can stop and speak to your child about the different ways that their body would warn them that something doesn't feel right. So it's all about their intuition. And as I said, because there may not actually be anything specifically happening that they need to say no to, or that they are identifying as inappropriate, but they're also allowed to listen to their body. And if they can understand what it feels like to essentially feel anxious or scared, then we want them to be able to say no. Okay, so the tricky part with this idea is that we also need to educate our relatives and possibly friends, but more often than not, it's the relatives, that we're actually giving our kids that autonomy over their body. So that can be very tricky if you have grandparents or aunties or uncles that really insist on lots of cuddles and kisses, and that can be very cultural too. But hopefully, when you educate the relatives or the friends and tell them the reason why you're actually not going to insist that your child responds with kisses and cuddles, or whatever it is that the relative wants them to do, unless they're comfortable. Now, hopefully you can soften that by still asking your child to respond in some way. So rather than just, letting them ignore, Nan or Pa as they walk in the door, perhaps you can suggest that they give a handshake, high five, or even a verbal response. So they're still showing respect to that person, but you're taking the intimacy out of it. And obviously, if any of your children were ever very, anxious or concerned about anyone in particular, trust your own instincts. And of course, you might want to question them just to see if there is anything there that they are genuinely worried or concerned about, as opposed to the normal things that two-year-olds often do to, attention seek. They'll often run in the opposite direction when Nana comes in wanting to squeeze those cheeks and get some kisses. Okay, so I can say no to a he or a she, a stranger, a friend, or my family. I can say no if they're cool or clever, sweet or kind. It just does not matter. So an opportunity for you to talk to your child about the people in their life and remind them that it does not matter who they are, what age they are, regardless, they are not allowed to do any of these things. Now, if someone did the wrong thing to me, it's not a secret. It just can't be. And no matter what they say to me, nothing terrible will come to be. Okay, so I said we're going to just delve into secrets a little bit. So ultimately, you want to avoid using the term secrets if you can in your household. When I first heard this, I was a little bit confused. I thought, oh my goodness, how are we not going to have secrets? But it's more about the terminology that you use. So if it's a surprise, if it's about someone's birthday or Christmas, then we refer to it as a surprise. If it's information that's private to the family, then you might want to call it family business. So for instance, if you're expecting another child and you don't want your little one to share it with the world yet, or you're moving houses, or it could be to do with a job, it's okay to tell your child that, but you do it in the context of it being family business. And it's important that you don't ever expect your child to keep it something to them forever. When we entrust our child with certain information, if we need to do that, then we need to make sure that it's only ever something that we're asking them to do in the short term. And so, of course, they are going to come across secrets when they are, in the playground, or, on TV, or streaming their shows. And so we also need to teach them what is a safe secret. And it's actually very simple. And this came from Act for Kids, who actually endorsed Only for Me. And so they were really helpful in helping me to articulate it. So safe secrets are never, ever about their body. And safe secrets are not secrets forever. So it's actually very simple. And so if we tell our kids, ultimately we try and not use the term secrets, but then if we teach them what a safe secret is, then if anyone asks them or insists that they keep a secret, particularly about this topic, the hope is that they'll obviously know to come and talk to you about it. Okay, and that final point there, no matter what they say to me, nothing terrible will come to be, is once again disarming them of those threats that they might make. For I'm not the one who's been bad, and keeping quiet will make me sad. So I'm not in trouble, but I must tell an adult that I can trust. Okay, so that's where I was intending on leaving Only for Me, but I was lucky to come across an academic paper before I went to print, and they analysed lots of resources on the topic going back to like the 1970s at the time, and no one had ever provided a framework for children who actually were thinking of disclosing. And so on that page there, what happens next? We're just setting out some framework for a child that is actually thinking that they might need to tell someone. Now, that adult's job is to help set me free from the bad things happening to me. First, they should make sure that it ends, then take me to someone to help me mend. But if that person doesn't know what they must do, it's okay. I just need to tell someone new. So with very young children, you might not want to read that to them. However, if you're reading it to someone and you are concerned about that they could have been exposed to inappropriate behaviour, then I would recommend reading that through with them. The most important thing, though, is getting them to understand that if they tell someone and that person doesn't do the right thing, if they don't get the help that they need to keep on telling. Because sadly, we know when a child does disclose to one person, if that person doesn't help or ignores them or doesn't believe them, they're actually very unlikely to go on and tell someone else. We want to empower them with the knowledge that they need to do that. So obviously we want to give them more than one option when it comes to speaking with people. So we're talking about their network of trust. So we often use the 5-finger drawing when we want to illustrate that network of trust for our kids. So you'll sit down with them and you'll ask them who are the people that they would like to have in their network of trust, and then you'll also need to guide them depending on the answers. Sometimes, it could be the family dog. Sometimes it can be, someone their own age, or sometimes perhaps it could be someone that is appropriate, but maybe they don't have access to that person. So it's just important that you do guide them. You can obviously write the names on those fingers, but for little kids, I actually recommend that you print off a little thumbnail, picture or photo of those people, and we need to make sure that this is something that we update at least once a year as circumstances change and different people come in and out of your child's life. Okay, so guys, that is only for me. Thank you so much for listening to it. As I said, I fully appreciate just how much content we need to cover tonight and how overwhelming it is. However, hopefully I've given you some hope that we are able to introduce this topic and we are able to cover all those points in a way that is gentle. So I'm not going to, I'm probably going to skip through this next slide, but essentially whenever we're talking to our kids about protective behaviours, we want to make sure that we are doing so on the basis of a very connected relationship with our kids. So there's no point in teaching them about this if they don't feel like we're available to them. So just very quickly, I recommend that you try and check in daily with your children. In the car is a great time while they're strapped in, they can't run away. Obviously family dinners and bedtime's another wonderful time to check in with your child, because they'll often want to put off going to bed, and so all of a sudden they'll often have a lot more detail they want to tell you about their day. Ask specific questions with your child. So rather than just saying, how was your day, you might want to ask them, what was the best thing that happened? What was the worst thing? What's something that made you smile? What's something that made you sad today? And you'll be more likely to get some more detailed information from them. And of course, have one-on-one time with each of your children individually. That does not need to be elaborate. I think it's wonderful for people that have the time and the means to go out on these wonderful dates with each of their children. However, it can be as simple as saying to your child that you're going to give them your attention for the next hour, and they get to choose a game, and you might sit there and play Lego with them or dress ups or whatever it might be, but that you just actually give them that one-on-one time, particularly if they're one of in a bigger family. And the final point very quickly is just if you have a child that finds it hard to speak up, who is a little bit withdrawn perhaps, and this comes out of my own experience with my eldest daughter, by giving them an alternate means to communicate with you, then you can encourage them to actually talk to you whenever they're worried. So I created what I called the pillow book with my daughter, and we wrote a little message in the front just affirming her, and I left it under her pillow one night for her to read. And the idea was that she would then write in it whenever she was feeling worried or concerned about anything. Unfortunately, it did work, but unfortunately, most of the times I was getting messages about how annoying her little sister was. But it did serve its purpose, and it did, in fact, help to bridge that gap. And then I found that because she had that alternative option, we were then able to establish a relationship where she felt more comfortable coming to talk to me. So really important that in the context of these conversations, we're nurturing those relationships with our children. Okay. Finally, if you want any information about the signs and indications that a child has been abused, you can head to onlyforme.com.au, and I've got some links on my website there. I don't want to go into it tonight, but there's a whole list of behaviours, but essentially it's about knowing what's normal for your child. And so it's when these things are out of character for your child that you might need to be concerned or actually look into it. Just to let you know that if you're ever concerned for the immediate safety of a child, you would call 000. However, in most cases, you'll find that a child is disclosed to you after the event, or perhaps you suspect abuse and you're not really sure. So there's also quite a few numbers there that I'll make available on these notes, which I'm happy to send through. They're also available on my website, and they are some of the organisations that we have here in Australia who can help talk you through and guide you when it comes to what your next steps might be. Okay, so we'll jump into the Q&A in a minute. I just ask that if I have achieved what we set out to, and that is you have a deep understanding now of why it's so important to have these conversations with our children, and that you also are feeling confident about how you go about it, then I just ask that you share. You share this message, you share this mission with your family, with your friends, with your groups, particularly on social media. It can be really easy, particularly if you're part of a bigger group, to just write a couple of lines about this topic, get the conversation going, and help to raise awareness, because ultimately we want to see a shift in generations to come, but it's not going to happen unless we all get involved. So it's not just about empowering, protecting your kids, but it's also about sharing the message. And if you would like to get a copy of Only for Me, I had a chat with Sarah today, and we've set up a coupon code for you. And so if you use that coupon code Unley, is that the right pronunciation? UNLEY 22. You can save $7.95, which is the postage and shipping component. And I'll actually send the books through to Sarah, and you can collect them from her. And I'm also going to throw in the Safe Kids series, which is a digital resource for parents unpacking this topic. And that will be on offer until the 12th of September, which is in a couple of weeks' time. And as I said, tonight is a very confronting topic. So if anyone does feel the need to talk to someone tonight, then I just encourage you to reach out, and you can access Lifeline 24 hours a day. All right, so that's it for me. I'll hand it back over to you, and we can see if we've got some questions to answer. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Michelle. That was fantastic. I wonder if we can get your face back so we can see you. But I found a number of things helpful from my perspective. Why I should use the correct term. I'm married to a physio, so she's made a point of making sure we get the biology right. Also, I love the way that you gave guidance on what are safe secrets. That was excellent. And overall, I just think you've thought so carefully and crafted a really strong approach to this. I just as an opening question, what if you had this book? When I read it, seems like it's for little children. What if you had like a 9-year-old or 11-year-old, and you're wanting to start this conversation? Is this book a good place to start? How would you approach that?
Well, you can certainly still use the book, whether or not they're engaged by it. Might be a different story, because it obviously is aimed at that younger age group. However, I have just offered to anyone access to the Safe Kids series, and that again unpacks the topic. So in terms of resources, I'm not sure what's out there for older children, but if you have the confidence to just sit down with your child and to speak to them one-on-one about the topic, then that's really important, because you're then establishing that communication and that opportunity for them to ask questions and clarify. And we want to support that conversation, so that whenever they are concerned or worried, they're then going to speak up and feel comfortable talking to us about the topic.
Thanks, Michelle. I really appreciate, just your ability to talk us through a difficult topic, but in just so specifically. I think you gave us lots of very specific language and examples of what we can use. And at the church here, I coordinate our playgroups, and as I've looked at your book a number of times, I really appreciate how there's not slabs of writing. There's just enough writing, but there's lots of scope to talk about the other things on the page. And I like the way you explained that today. That was really helpful. I'm curious to know, from a person that would have read this book to children, could you give us a kind of an idea of what are some of the responses or reactions or comments that children give in the process of reading it, just to kind of give us a feel for what it's like to sit and read it with a child?
Well, like I said, I have actually been blown away by the response of children reading Only for Me. I'm amazed that they actually love it. Obviously, I wanted it to engage them, but I never imagined that it would be a book that they actually, want to read over and over again. They tend to learn, because it's written in rhyme, they tend to like to learn the words off by heart. So I've had a few people tell me how their child will be walking around the house quoting from Only for Me. Sadly, I've also had parents contact me who have received a disclosure after reading Only for Me. And that's obviously bittersweet, because obviously that's ultimately what we want to achieve, but it's obviously hard to hear these different situations. One way that Only for Me has actually surprised me in terms of the way that it is, or the feedback that I've gotten from it, is the way that it's actually helped adult survivors of abuse. I guess I can't speak from experience, but for those people, even though that they understand what happens, they've actually expressed to me that they didn't have the words to talk to their children about it. It's something that they're really concerned about, having experienced it themselves, but they just didn't have the words. And so it's actually been really healing for a lot of adult survivors of abuse. So that's been really beautiful too.
Both Sarah and I, and there's some teachers too, we work with families and children, and I think you've given us helpful language for when we communicate around these kinds of areas. I have one last question, which is children are often quite body innocent, and I actually think that's fantastic, because especially in their home, they feel safe there. So is that body innocence, is that challenged by this approach to trying to help children also be body safe?
It is very tricky, and to be honest, that's how I felt. So prior to going on this journey, one of the other reasons why I hadn't really spoken to my children about this topic was that I really wanted to protect their innocence. And I feel like our kids grow up in an over-sexualized world way too quickly. And so I actually thought by not talking to them, I was actually going to be protecting their innocence, which of course is important. But the more I learned, the more I realized that it is the lesser of two evils, and that unfortunately that's part of the reality that we live in. So whilst we do want to protect their innocence as much as possible, we can't ignore the topic, and we do need to talk to them about it, but we can do it in a way that is gentle and dignified. And as I said, if you start early, you'll find that it just becomes such a natural and normal conversation for them. And so that really helps as well. It tends to take away that fear response, I think, when we're talking to them from a young age. But 100%, it's it's a challenge to balance the reality against ultimately protecting our kids' innocence.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And I do appreciate the way that you've given us lots of vocabulary to kind of put in place that is actually a natural way of introducing the topic and speaking to our children to create that connection as well in a healthy relationship. So really appreciate all of that. I don't know if there's any other questions at the moment. So I think I'll close it off there with just a really big thank you for all that you've put into this, and for your generosity with your books, and just offering those at a discount, and just your interaction with us has been really positive, and we just really appreciate your passion and your efforts to really want to keep children safe. So thank you so much for advocating for kids, and for really being brave to step into a space that's actually quite hard and quite heavy. And we really appreciate you doing all of that for us. So thank you very much, Michelle.
There are a number of comments in the chat as well saying that it's absolutely wonderful. The book is brilliant and a real eye-opener. Glad I joined. So some great feedback there. We will be emailing people the resources, the links to the things that you've just talked about. Also, Michelle put a PowerPoint there, so I'll PDF that and include that in the email. You can order the books. I was just talking to Sarah. So will those books be, if you're in South Australia or in Adelaide, will they be coming in bulk to our church? Is that right? Oh, sorry, wait.
To save on the shipping, they will go in bulk order to you guys. But if someone would just prefer to have it delivered directly to their home, then they don't need to use the code.
Okay, that's because some people don't live close to here. Some are far away from what I can see on the chat. But if you're close to us, then you'll be able to get that, pick it up from us. This is a heavy topic, but we love our children. We want them to be safe, and I think you've opened our eyes to the fact that it's not just adults that could be a challenge for our children, but actually their own peers or children themselves. So that's enlightening, disturbing, and important for us to be aware of. So I trust you've all found this helpful, and have things that you think you can do from here. I know that would have been Michelle's intent, that this is a doable thing. One of the things I'd like to do just as we close is pray for our kids and our families, if you don't mind. God, I do pray for children. I pray that they would be well informed and know what they should do in circumstances that we're just dealing with or talking about tonight. And then I pray for the adults around them, the ones that they trust. Help us have the wisdom and the courage to both protect and support them. It's really sad that 1 in 5 children, it seems, will experience some kind of sexual abuse And we would ask our God that change, that is too sad. It's not right. And we'd love for our society and our families to be safer places for children. And we ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Michelle. It's really terrific. Great to meet you and great to listen to you. So everyone have a great night.